one of the big things that's happened with this initiative is the writers, getting people to write in a different manner. There's a certain kind of email that I get from writers that says, I've never been challenged to think in this way, to write something positive. I've been writing dystopian stories for my whole life, and now I flexed a muscle that's got me moving in a different direction, and I'm kind of hooked and I want to try this again. Thank you.
That's Tory Stephens. He works at Grist Magazine as their climate fiction creative manager. I'm Lee Schneider, and this is the Future Lab. As Grist's climate fiction creative manager, Tory uses storytelling to champion climate justice and imagine green, clean, and just futures. He's going to tell us about a climate fiction contest called Imagine 2200 that he says changed him and challenged him on a personal level. It also inspired thousands of writers to explore what it would be like to write hopeful fiction about the future. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Tory Stephens. Tory, thanks so much for doing this, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
I first discovered what you were working on by reading Joy Donnell's story in Grist's Imagine 2200 Climate Fiction Initiative. I saw that on LinkedIn. She posted it there. Can you tell us how this whole thing came about? How did it start?
Yeah, so Imagine at this point is 4 years old, and we're coming up on our fourth contest. And a big part of this is the contest, but we also publish stories like the one that you encountered with Joy Donnell's story. That one's a part of our editor's picks. Unfortunately, she didn't win the contest, but her story was excellent. We received thousands of stories, and hers was like one of the ones that was really like resonating with us. So we knew at some point we wanted to publish it. The contest came about because Grist was exploring quietly whether they should bring a literary or climate fiction or something other than just the news to their offerings or their website. For the listeners, Grist is a nonprofit, independent news media organization and has been around for 25 years. It's actually Grist's 25th year. And we're solely focused on the climate from the angles of justice, climate solutions, and bringing the environmental news that you all crave and need in this day and age. So we were exploring quietly behind the scenes. I got into a conversation with the founder of Grist, Chip Geller, and he said, I've been thinking about bringing climate fiction to Grist. And this is when I was not in this driver's seat. At the time, I was a network weaver, which was a very cool title for a very cool job. It was basically bringing folks together to have conversations around climate solutions and hope. And he just wanted to get my idea on it. And I said, I don't know much about climate fiction at all. I had come from the fundraising world and had only been at Grist for about 3 months at that time. And so climate fiction was just really that was the first time I had heard of it. Fast forward to a few months later, we are at a retreat and I'm doing my network weaving and I'm bringing people together and we're having this retreat where it's folks discussing just their different climate solutions that they're bringing into the world and other people kind of learning about them, asking questions about them and inspecting those things. And we did this because Grist has a list kind of like Times 100 or Forbes 50. We have a list called Grist 50. And it showcases 50 people from across the United States that are focused on climate solutions or justice, or climate justice, I should say. And so those are the people we were convening. And right at the tail end of that, retreat that we were having for three days, Chip said, I want to do something different. Grist has been around at this time, I think it was 20 years. And he said, what if we were to offer something new at Grist? What would it be? Just like go into small groups. We broke those people into small groups, and then they came back and they presented their ideas. And one of the groups said, you all should do climate fiction. And for him, that was a real tell because we had already been exploring this. And then here's these kind of like movers and shakers, saying the same thing. And it was just something in the heart of what Chip Geller wanted. He wanted to bring something that is creative and could speak to people in a different way other than just the news, the facts, the figures around what's happening. And so yeah, I said, he approached me and said, well, will you help me kind of bring this together, bring this energy together, try to like think through what's the business model, what's the kind of approach, what kind of climate fiction do we do? And the thing about Grist that they've always had is this ethos around, um, no, not, they want to break the cycle of doom and gloom. And that's been like that was the tagline for years. We've moved on from that tagline, but that was the kind of ethos and still is for like 20 years. And so we knew that that's the kind of climate fiction we wanted to bring. Something that was hopeful, something that was around the climate solutions. And then we started to scratch like what's the other things other than just that. And I said, let's do something different. Instead of us just thinking about this, let's widen the circle and let's bring back those Grist 50 folks from all different walks of life, who are scientists, activists, novelists, just a whole range of people, influencers, fashion folks that are all working on a climate solution. And so we brought those folks together pre-pandemic and we started to plan this whole thing, and it was going to be an in-person retreat, and then the pandemic happened. So then we had to really pivot because we still wanted to have this convening where we talked about climate fiction and the type of climate fiction we want to bring to Grist. And so we ended up pivoting to using Miro and online whiteboard technology. And we involved a couple facilitators that could help us with this facilitation because Zoom was new to us, using Miro was new to us. And one of the gentlemen that we worked with, Adam Burke, he he was like, you know what? I have a background that I think is relevant here. And he said, when I was younger, I used to play D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. And I was like, okay, where's this going? And he was like, I think that we should bring this convening of people together and have them all go on a quest, like a D&D quest, and combined it with your all's ideas of doing a visioning quest, and we'll be able to get them to dream and think through about the world that they want. But essentially, they'll be dropping gems around the kind of climate fiction they want. And so, fast forward to a couple months later, we put people into these different groups and sent them on a quest together. The folks didn't know each other, and they could dream, envision the future they wanted. We called that game at the time Imagine 2200. It was just a game. We didn't even think that that would be the name of the climate fiction initiative we started. We just created it for this specific instance. And that game was a lot of fun. And I learned a ton from all the things that these people put on their timelines. There was these timelines to how do you get to a clean, green, and just world is what we asked them. And so everybody went on their own quest, and on their way they had to map a way to get to this beautiful world of 2200, where we've solved a lot of the crisis, where we're in right relationship with ourselves and the earth, and where justice is a kind of a big piece of this whole thing. And the things I learned after that, there was all these beautiful timelines on these Miro boards. I sat with them. They gave me 2 months to sit with these kind of ideas and sift through them. And people put things on there that I just wouldn't have, if I did this alone, climate fiction wouldn't have been as dynamic as it is at Grist, because it wouldn't have had all these ideas that I encountered and were somewhat new to me. I didn't know about the land back movement, just ceding lands back to the indigenous folks. I didn't know about that. That wasn't something I had moved from fundraising in the health advocacy world to climate. And, this was a new concept to me. Some of the justice folks were really pushing hard for reparations for Black and brown folk, and tying that to the climate movement and how it's relevant. And there was abolitionists also at the table, folks who don't believe in the kind of police state and prisons and want to, really abolish those. That was something that I had heard about, but I didn't know about it in great detail and how people were linking it to the climate issues that are happening in jails and other places. And so this I was just swirling with all this new information. And what I did was we squished those things into the prompt that we now put out to the world. So when we ask for a story, we ask for climate fiction that's hopeful and has climate solutions. That's probably where we would have left it if it wasn't for this meeting that we had. What we've added is that we want intersectional characters. We have a focus on folks that are marginalized and on the front lines of the climate fight. So folks living in island nations, could be Louisiana, could be food deserts, a lot of different things there. And yeah, so that's how we got to this kind of I would call it like a dynamic climate fiction that is inclusive.
It's really, the details mattered so much, didn't they? Seeing all those levels, some of which were new to you, really mattered.
Yeah, yes, they did.
Grist has always impressed me, even from way back, with that sense of detail and a systemic approach to things and to the world. Why do you think climate justice needs to go deep and address these foundational problems? And does climate fiction need to do that also?
Yeah, from the justice, I mean, for me, justice is just a sort of way to communicate that we care for other humans, right? And that there is a right way to walk and live your life. I grew up evangelical, and so there's this really deep desire to do good in the world. I'm not evangelical anymore, but that kind of ethos is still there in wanting to care for my fellow humans and my neighbors and, love thy neighbor, that sort of thing is still like deeply a part of who I am as a person. And so in the health advocacy space, I was advocating for justice, and I learned that the reason we want to go deep is because we want other people to be happy, healthy, and whole. And, many folks, a lot of the reason people are calling for justice is because there's trauma in people's lives. Trauma that they did not bring to their life, trauma that is coming from outside of their community or even in their community, but is not right. You have to have a strong idea of what is wrong and what is right. And I think like a lot of people know this. And so to have a justice lens is really to just do good by others. And I think in climate fiction, we want to do the same. And like the kind of climate fiction we're bringing to the table is showcasing the visions that people have of a more just world, because we live in a world that isn't always just. You look at places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana and what's been happening to the black and brown folks down there, and that is clearly unjust and unfair. Like, it shouldn't be that people have cancer that they didn't you know, bring to themselves. They didn't do these things. These things have been done to them. Indigenous folks who've been pushed off their land for, hundreds of years, and us not thinking about ceding back some of the land or even a lot of land back to them, I think is unjust. And so the reason we want to depict these things in climate fiction, I used to say it was just because, we want to talk about these things, right? But we also want to vision what that world looks like. So what does it look like when you cede lands back to folk? What does it look like when you clean up Cancer Alley and people are thriving and their health is not in decline because of the poisons in the water due to the fossil fuel industry and the plastic industry as well. So we want to show what that looks like. Sometimes people say like, "Oh, that's utopian," and like, is it utopian to kind of like have a world where someone has like clean water in a nice place to kind of raise their kids that is free of violence, and the air quality is good? That's not utopian, right? And sometimes we do get utopian stories that are like really pushing in a way that I've never seen. But even then, I'm like, is it really utopian? Like, one of the far ideas that I'm thinking of is like being in right relationship with animals and deciding that they too deserve rights, that we have, and that we're not just domineering over these animals and that we can, kill them at will or whatnot. And so, some people will be like, oh, well, that's like a utopian idea. I don't think so. It doesn't have to be. And so we just want to explore justice from a fictional lens that allows us to vision the world that we want and to some folks the world that they deserve.
I wanted to dig into that a little bit. One of the secret agendas of mine of doing this podcast, not so secret that since I'm announcing it, is I want to show the roadmap to writing this kind of fiction that models the future and
Mm,
is utopian in a way that seems like it could really happen. I have a saying, writing about dystopia is easy, but utopia is hard. And
mm.
the authors in the contests now, they're telling stories of the challenges ahead of us, but they're also modeling the way to maybe overcome them, or at least be more sustainable and have a more just world. Now, my question here is, can a story do that? Does fiction really help create a better reality?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, one of the things that so this is one thing that I've been harping on for a little while now is the lack of third spaces in American life. I don't know if folks don't know what a third space is, just for the folks that are listening. It is your bowling alley, your coffee shop, anywhere that's not your home or work. And now that many people work from home, that is like their one space. And so we're not interacting with each other as much as we should be. Oftentimes our third space is this like social media place. And what I think these stories do is they allow third spaces to pop up. So book clubs, story reading sessions, meetups where people talk about some of the solutions that are happening in these stories. That's the sort of thing that helps people because right now there's a lack of social belonging, and I think that's not just an American crisis. It's a kind of like modernity crisis, something that comes along with modernity and all the technology we have. And I think it's a part of the problem for us to solve so that we can solve the climate crisis. We need to talk about this as a community, the things that are happening in our local environment and area, and what solutions we can provide. And I don't think that social media will be you can get some things done on social media, but we're going to have to talk with each other at libraries, in public squares, sitting down in the grass, what have you, building community. And so that's one part of this, building out like a third. These stories can allow for a third space to kind of bloom if you build that around them. So that's one thing that I'm just like suggesting people do because I want to see more of that, and I think it's helpful. The other piece around like the visions that they can offer is that people, when you write and you imagine, you can create visions in ways of being with each other that don't exist right now. You can create a piece of tech that doesn't exist right now but is needed, or the writer sees as needed. I mean, Star Trek is like the OG of this, right? I'm not a huge Star Trek fan. I like it when I watch it, but I don't know all the like people and the gizmos. But they had like a cell phone thing, like years ago, and now lo and behold, we have cell phones. So and you can reference so many other books, and books don't always just do tech. Like that's the sci-fi community that leans on tech. But just again, how do we live with each other? How do we mitigate our relationships? Because a lot of these stories, even though they are utopian, or I would say that 30% are probably utopian. Others are what I'm calling, and others are calling through utopia. We can get into what through utopia is a little bit more later if you want, but offering a pathway to a beautiful and better world. And then there's this other piece of it, which is other than just the throughtopia, utopia, the visions, there's this moment where you can see an arc or a choice that needs to be made, right? A lot of these stories, you were saying like dystopian versus utopian stories are harder to tell. Well, one of the things I've seen a lot of the writers do is where the character has to make a big choice around what are they going to do? Are they going to leave Earth or stay? We have a few of those. I think there's been two stories that were really big with us. One was Earthbound that we published recently, And then we also have another one called Afterglow, which is also the same name of the book that we published in 2 or 3 years ago. In both of those stories, the world is not totally sorted out, but it's getting better. But some people still think it's not worth investing in Earth. We should leave. And the main characters in these stories, they both decide to stay. Sorry for the spoiler, but I think so again, uh, not all these stories are utopian. They some lean in that direction, but others lean in the direction of just having hope that we will make it as humans, and that the Earth will become this like flourishing place where it's not overpolluted and it's clean, green, and just. And so that's one of the mechanics I see is like, let's make a big choice. And then another one, when sometimes people are further along on the scale of moving towards or in utopia, is just showing the social dynamics of what, there's still choices, right? I'll give an example of a story that we have. There's a beautiful story called Seven Sisters about women on a tea farm, and they're working in right relationship with each other. There's folks from all different walks of life and background, and their salesperson who takes, they use like old school kind of ships to kind of move around the world because they don't want to use, motor in fossil fuels, and so that person is in Brazil at the time. They're selling the tea. They're placing or they're taking orders from different buyers and whatnot. And the farm is moving along, but then they have an issue with their like drones, and those go down. So then they have to pick the tea themselves, and that's like a lot more laborious. And they're trying to figure out how to mitigate this issue. And then the person who has a big heart that is in Brazil selling tea comes home, and they bring migrants with them, climate migrants, like a woman and her daughter, and the community, which is very accepting, very justice driven, caring community, still at that time, because they're having financial issues with their drones and they have to replace them, and so there's a choice again. Do we accept these people? Do we take them in, even though we're having a hardship of our own and there's some financial issues? In the end, they end up doing it. Spoiler again, sorry. But yeah, that's another example. Just interpersonal relationships inside of a community, where things are looking good, but there's still hard choices to be made, even in a quote unquote utopia.
I think that's so well put. One thing that fiction does so well is pose a problem, and then you put your characters, they either figure it out or they don't. Tragedy, they don't
Right.
figure it out. Comedy or positive, they figure it out. And science fiction and climate fiction adds that extra level, as you're saying. We pose a problem as writers, as creators of these stories. We pose a problem and we put our people through it, and then they either figure it out or they don't figure it out.
Well, let me say something about don't figure it out. I think like there was a writer who was saying that you want to put your character through hell, and then right when they're like getting back up, you're going to put them through some more hell, right? And like you're going to present all these problems and make life difficult so that the reader is just like, and
Yeah.
we're trying to just pose the problem. What if you help them, you show these characters solving problems? What if you show them working in right relationship to each other? And when we first started this out, I wasn't sure that if you could do that and have a compelling story. But after 3 or 4 years, we have a ton of stories that are compelling and great, that show the opposite of dystopia. And just for the listeners out there, like, I'm not someone who hates dystopian stories. I love them. Some of my favorite stories are dystopian, and I think they're useful. The clarion call of we don't want that kind of world is great. But I think what we don't have enough of are the stories that showcase the world we want.
True. And what this whole line of thought solves a problem for the story creator, which is if you think you know more than your reader and you really think you know more than your characters, there's the danger of getting ahead and just kind of saying it, sort of preaching it, sort of pushing it on people. But
Mhm.
if you stated in this problem way and have your characters, honestly, if you know your characters well, figure it out or not figure it out, then you're not getting too far ahead of your reader, and your reader can go through the process with the character, which I think is kind of what you want, because you want the reader,
Hmm.
the appreciator of that tale, to have the same kind of revelation that the character has. Maybe a page or two before the character, or a page or two after the character, or right at the time of the character having it, but you want to be in sync there. And I think this way of thinking about it helps us do that.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree.
Some people have complained, like Bill McKibben in a interview a few years back, that there's not enough climate fiction being written. He asked something to the effect of, where are the movies and where are the plays and where are the novels? And we're seeing a development of this sort of thing, but he might argue, and I would argue for sure, not enough.
Hmm.
Where's the opera? There's been a few here and there and a few attempts at movies, some of which have been good. What's your thought on why there's not even more of this kind of fiction happening right now?
That's a really good question. I know that, so I've worked with a outfit, a nonprofit called Good Energy. They have been looking at this from a statistical standpoint. They have combed and worked with universities to look over keywords that are in movies, in movie scripts. And what they found is that a measly below 3% of the stories in the last like 15 years that we see on screen have not included words like global warming, climate change, or have had a plot that is focused on that. And so it's a big problem. It's an identifiable problem. Like it makes no sense that the best storytellers in our world, in the pop world right now, Hollywood,
Right.
billions of dollars, millions of dollars, entertaining people in a variety of genres, on a variety of levels, from comedy to horror to you name it, action. Why can't they construct a climate fiction story that is exciting and, a blockbuster? And so I don't really have the answer for why this isn't happening. I don't think there's any conspiracy. I think it's like more, God, maybe it won't sell. They think it's scary. Maybe it's too politically divisive and they feel that they may lose half their audience, because some think that climate change isn't real. I don't know. Really, it's like one of those things that's a conundrum. But I think, again, instead of like, so this is funny because it's like the problem was identified as there aren't enough
Hmm.
stories out there, in films, movies, scripts. And so what you see happening is I'm on the Hollywood Climate Summits Advisory Board, and they produce an event every year, and they do a whole bunch of other activities, but their big gathering that happens in LA is focused solely on this. Let's educate the public and the industry leaders in Hollywood about the fact that it's a measly 3%. Like, we're not even sure that they all know that. So so they've been doing at that for like 3 years now, and more every time that I've gathered with them and attended their sessions, I see bigger names adding in the roster or at the event, caring about the fact that or I wouldn't even say caring, just learning about the fact that there's this like lack of climate fiction films. And so I don't know if I have a good answer for you why it's happening, but I do know those two outfits plus a couple others are looking to change it and educate people. And they are also some of the people that worked on those two projects, Good Energy and the Hollywood Climate Summit, helped work on a film called Extrapolations that was on Apple, I forget Apple TV, I think they call it.
I think this might be a good time to bring back in the idea of Throughtopia
Okay.
as a way to tell these stories that is engaging and shows a pathway through. So describe it a bit and expand on it a little bit.
Yeah, so Throughtopia is a term that came out of the UK, and it essentially is saying that, there's a whole bunch of stories that people are classifying as utopia when they're really not. There's stories about a community or a person, a character, and they're working towards this goal of having a greener world, a cleaner world, a more just world. And you get to see a good Utopia, I think, would show, um if you had a novel. I don't know, I don't think at this point, because if you want to call it a genre, or the label of Utopia is not that old. It's like 4 years old. And so maybe looking back, there's some stories that do this already and are using the mechanics or kind of fit the bill. But right now there's not a novel that is like that I know of that is like a Throughtopia, a blueprint of sorts on, instead of showing the end result, like we're all living in this happy, clean, green, and just world. What are the things that happen between that? What's the battle? Like, how did we, stop using fossil fuel? Was that like a fight? Was that policy? Was that like public opinion? Um, then what happened? Like, what happened after we stopped using fossil fuel? How did the transition happen? Where did it happen first? Did China beat America? Did they collaborate? Was it because of some tech billionaire? Probably not. you know did activists kind of push, politicians and society to kind of, see the problem and then, move on that? But what does that actually look like on the ground? And so, yeah, that's kind of the vein of stories that sometimes we publish, and the ones that we look to and label as through Utopia, because Utopia doesn't fit well, and then they're definitely not dystopian. I mean, you could just call them a story, but the point was to encourage more people to create through Utopia. And so, let's dream a little, let's use visioning and the power of fiction in our imagination to show the variety of ways that we could get to a fossil free world, and living in a place where, justice is more vibrant, and happening for folks that are on the front lines of this climate crisis.
The few writers working recently and now that I've seen are doing it without the label because it didn't exist is Ursula Le Guin often writes stories that are we're past the point of our worst nightmares and we're living in a world that is better and has its own problems, but takes us to the next step. And Anne Leckie, who wrote Translation State and a very popular trilogy, kind of gets there too. Uh, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future is a way of trying to work through how we might get to these better places. And what he does that's pretty compelling is combine grindy, bureaucratic characters who are just working on this day by day by day and look like they have horrible yet fulfilling lives, and some pretty radical people who do, you could say, bad things. And he's what I'm getting out of that is he's finding a way, the author, to show us that between these extremes, there's a middle ground somehow.
And I would classify Ministry of the Future has some Throughtopia-ness to it, and also some solar punkness and some climate fiction. It's a little bit all three.
Let's back into this a little because we've kind of talked about it, but I haven't asked the question is what has been the reception to the initiative? How has it been received and what are people saying about it?
Yeah, there has been, I would say overall it's been a positive reception. If one of the metrics I would say that's important for us is, there's two sides of this. There's the audience. There's the people who are going to read these stories and what they take from the stories and the gatherings they have, the book clubs. And but I want to focus before we talk about the audience, because that's normally where a media organization would go. They'd say, well, we have like big numbers, like people are reading the stories. But for us, one of the big things that's happened with this initiative is the writers, getting people to write in a different
Mm.
manner. I receive lots of emails from people who unfortunately didn't win the contest, but they're still appreciative of the fact that they just basically, there's a certain kind of email that I get from writers that says, I've never been challenged to think in this way, to write something positive. I've been writing dystopian stories for my whole life, and now I flexed a muscle that's got me moving in a different direction, and I'm kind of hooked and I want to try this again. Thank you. So people reach out and tell us that, and I think that for me is like, yeah, that's like the most, forget metrics, forget like those things that you track on the back end, like how long was someone viewing this article or that. That for me is like that's my happy place, I guess, for the whole project. It's like, of course I'm happy when people read it and they're like, oh my God, like I love a great story. This story's good. I shared it, and it made me think about my garden or whatever. But having writers kind of think differently, and the fact that we've been able to do that with close to 4,000 writers, 4,000 people have submitted stories that are their vision of a clean, green, and just world that is focused on climate solutions and hope. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So that's one piece, and then the other side is, of course, the part that we're always looking to, which is how successful has it been, as in, is it resonating with our audience? So the Grist audience that Grist already has, the folks that come there for the regular news and things that we publish, the investigative journalism and things of that nature, a good amount of them have liked it. If you like the climate, most likely, if you are into literary things or short stories, you don't mind a climate story because like you're already someone who cares about the climate. So that's been helpful. But then I didn't know this, but the solar punk community kind of loves the project, and they're, a lot of the people that we've worked with, reviewers and judges, have been solar punks or written solar punk. And then one of our reviewers, Serena Ulabari, is a big editor and writer in the solar punk world. And so that was a big surprise for us. Grist had never communicated or been in touch with people, solar punks, and now they're a part of our community. And I've learned a ton from the folks that are in the solar punk community. I think that their movement is one that is needed and is very dynamic, and it is a movement. It has all the accoutrements of a movement, music, art. It's not just a genre of stories, that live in books. There's a whole group of people that consider themselves solar punks and try to build DIY projects and live their life in a very positive and progressive way.
Yeah, awesome. All of that resonates me, but one thing that resonates a lot is the idea of inspiring people toward writing a story or reading a story that has that Thutopia idea or has a positive idea. It's kind of like these days I like reading books about nature because I want to appreciate nature.
Hmm.
And if I can recommend a book that's just about nature that appreciates birds and animals and trees, well, it's going to be harder to give that stuff up, I think, if we get a deeper appreciation of those things. So, what's next for Imagine 2200? There's a print anthology already out, right?
Yeah, you alluded to the anthology. So we already have an anthology out called Afterglow. That was produced 3 years ago. It's great. You should check it out. It's with the New Press, which was the publisher at the time. We've moved over to working with Milkweed Editions. They're the folks that brought us Braiding Sweetgrass, and they were producing a book where, instead of just 1 year's, so the first book, just to back up, was every story that had won in the first year. The second book has stories from years 2 and 3, and so there's more stories, which is great, because you'll have more stories to read. And that book comes out in October, I think 22nd or that week. So it's coming out soon, and um, so that's one piece that we have that is done, that is out there, or will be out there, and the other book is out there. The other thing we're doing is this visioning thing that I talked to you about earlier. We are, instead of just using that technique to just keep it with us and with what we did with climate fiction, we also want to bring that, and we have brought that. So we work with Aspen Ideas, we work with TED, and we've worked with some of the writers that we hosted a convening to do what we call collective visioning. We had them play the game Imagine 2200, where folks went on a quest and they envisioned and plotted a path on a timeline to get to a clean, green, and just world. And what we found was that there's different people that can use visioning in a variety of ways to get epiphanies, climate epiphanies. And we want to produce climate epiphanies, like people who had never encountered geothermal, networked geothermal. We want them to encounter that because someone else brought it up. So it's kind of like a cafe model, a world cafe model, where you kind of just get to learn about different things in the climate world that are positive, that are happening in these aren't like fiction things. They're things that are happening right now. And so the visioning is a really great way to showcase that, but then also people can lean into, but what if we did this? So that's an offering that we're going to be showcasing and having. We have a couple more of those events because they're either live, or we use the mural whiteboard thing in Zoom to gather people and have them vision, the world that they feel that we all deserve. So I think the biggest focus will be more of the contests, a little bit of the visioning, and then trying to get these stories to market in the book kind of way. Because what I've heard from a lot of people is that I love reading stories, but reading 5,000 words online, on my desktop is just not, for me. It's not it. That's what they'll say, and so the book allows you to kind of bring it where you want. Your eyes get less tired in a different way. You read books, so it's like it's just I yeah, I'd rather a book than read something online. And I don't know if most people I can read news, but then a story for some reason I'd just rather a book.
Yeah, it's so much more portable and user friendly at the end. I mean, I like taking notes with online gadgets, but to actually read for pleasure also.
Yeah.
So, where can people learn more about all these wonderful things about you and about Grist online?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start is our About page. So just Google About Imagine 2200 and you should get our About page.
Mm.
And then from there, you just scroll down, learn about the project a little bit. And then at the bottom are all the collections that we have. So right now we have about 5 different collections, which include some editors' picks that we've pulled, ones that we didn't win the contest, but we either thought like, maybe should have won, or like we just liked it a lot. Everyone has their own opinion about what makes a good story, and so and then some of them. Then also you can check out all the previous contests that we've published. So there's been 3 of those. So a total of 36 stories that have won and been reviewed and judged. And again, these stories are from all over the globe, from Malaysia to Australia to Jamaica. There's some stories. One thing we didn't talk about that I think is important to leave with folks is that there's a deep cultural authenticity to some of the stories that we've published. Where the
Mm.
place, like for instance, I just mentioned Jamaica. There's a woman who wrote a story that won in year 2, and there's a lot of Jamaican patois in there, and there's a lot of the food and the vibrancy of the Jamaican life, and so that's just one example. But many of our stories are very much place based, and the writer, is from that particular place and has infused it with a lot of the culture that comes with living in Malaysia or Jamaica or Ukraine.
That's a really great answer to the person who says, well, why should I write this story? Because everybody's already written all these stories before, but no one's written the story from your exact perspective.
Right.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Thanks for thinking of me. I'm glad that the story moved you to reach out to me.
Thanks for listening to the Future Lab today. Please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the podcast. If you have some comments for me, go to memo.fm/thefuturelab and record them. I may play them on a future episode. That's memo.fm/thefuturelab. See you next time. I'm Lee Schneider, Artistic Director at FutureX.